Bettina has trained as a clinical psychologist and became one of Australia's first sex therapists, working mainly in the media and talking about sex on television and radio, as well as teaching doctors and other professionals about sexual counselling. She then became really well known as a commentator and a rare public voice speaking about the problems that are confronting men and boys. 5 years ago, Bettina was awarded an AM for promoting gender equity through advocacy for men, and an award which followed her controversial campus tour, drawing attention to unfair treatment of males in university kangaroo courts. Bettina continues her advocacy through blogs on Substack, video, and has quite a presence on YouTube and regular media appearances. Bettina, I'm going to ask the same question about your thoughts on parental alienation, but I want to set the context here that I know recently, or in recent times, you've spent time interviewing family dispute resolution practitioners in this family law space. You even recently interviewed a former family court judge. So you may have some unique insights from the people that you've been working with and all that work that you're doing. But I'd like to start off by asking you the same question. How would you define parental alienation?
Thank you, JD, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. When I look at what is parental alienation, I think it's simply what it says it is. It's a deliberate attempt by one parent to alienate the children from the other parent, poisoning or attempting to destroy that relationship. I mean, I think it's a waste of time to fuss over definitions. The community knows exactly what we're talking about if we use this common sense term. So going on to, I'm going to actually just incorporate the questions, JD, into
please do.
Here. So as to my position on parental alienation and what do I base that on, I actually had experience of parental alienation an awfully long time ago, nearly half a century ago, when I was in my first marriage and became a stepmother and watched my husband go through the absolute agony of dealing with being alienated from his children, being not allowed to see them. I'd listen to him crying in the night, calling out for them, the misery of not being able to even see them at Christmas when he was able to deliver the presents at night, including this train set he'd worked on for months for his little boy. I mean, it was utter anguish for him and also just living with him through all of that. We were really lucky. Things moved on. We ended up with joint custody. So that was a long time ago. But since then, probably for the last 40 years, I've spent most of my time talking to men and talked to so many men, hundreds of men who've gone through all of this. And I now receive dozens of letters every week from men who are despairing at the whole experience of being cut off from their children. And as Glenn said, I mean, we've got this very clear link now, data showing this clear link between suicide rates and relationship breakup. And it's an issue that unfortunately hasn't received nearly as much attention as it should have. Of course, as everybody's saying, women suffer parental alienation too. There are men who actively seek to punish their partners by destroying their relationships with their children. And women in that situation, their anguish is just as real. But what really concerns me is the broader societal aspect of this absolutely dreadful issue. The fact that we have state-sanctioned alienation of children. And that's a consequence of the weaponization of our justice system against men. We have children growing up with their fathers, and with all the proven risks for kids of growing up in fatherless families. And that's the result, in my view, of this distinct and increasing bias in our justice system against men. As JD said, a few months ago, I was very lucky. I was able to do an interview with a former family court judge, Stuart Lindsay, for YouTube. And he was very outspoken about what's going on here, saying that the family court system is in enormous trouble because of promotion of feminist ideology in the Family Law Act. And at the heart of this issue is domestic violence, namely this feminist claim that all other considerations regarding the best interests of children must be swept aside by the need to protect youngsters from dangerous dads. And of course, what this does is it incentivizes false allegations of violence because it gives women immense power throughout the family law process. Power to have dad removed from the home, denied contact with the children, sometimes for years before the matter is resolved in the family court. And what Lindsay told me is that judges are under enormous pressure to bend the knee to the notion that there is this huge risk to children from their fathers. And there's simply no good evidence to support the idea that this is the case for the majority of Australian families. We have a best survey on domestic violence in this country, comes from the Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey, and which finds only 0.7% of women say they've had been physically assaulted, had physical violence from their partner or ex-partner in the last year. But that means 99% of Australian men aren't violent, aren't physically violent towards their partner. And what we see in our community, in the public narrative, is this greatly inflated figures, which are based on the notion of an epidemic of violence, using definitions of violence that endlessly expanded to include emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, and of course now coercive control. And it's really it's obvious that our justice system must protect women from dangerous men, women and children from dangerous men. Most cases involving violence protection orders are now based on these much less serious behaviours that I've just mentioned, or on false allegations. All the evidence shows that women are just as likely to be perpetrators of this behaviour as men are. We've had 50 years now of international research showing this. There was a major meta-analysis. This was the Partners Abuse State of Knowledge project based on 1,700 peer-reviewed studies. And that showed most physical violence is two-way, with women just as likely to instigate it as the men. Of course, when physical violence does occur, there's no question that women are more likely to be harmed due to men's greater strength. But this two-way violence is what our police are seeing when they go into violent homes. And they're now under enormous pressure to ignore the female violence and only charge men, or to issue violence protection orders to women even when the evidence is suggesting that they might be exaggerating or making things up. I've done a bunch of interviews recently with police prosecutors, talking about how unhappy they are to be put into a situation where they're forced to ignore the truth that they see before them and only believe women. And what Stuart Lindsay told me was that when these cases are properly examined in court, most of the allegations are either withdrawn or fall apart. But the real point is that these allegations have been really successfully used to deny men contact with their children, often for years, which means that the fathers are unbelievably disadvantaged when it comes to arguing before the family court about meaningful share of the children. You know, the status quo argument is what we hear all the time, and that carries huge weight. The children barely know that. They haven't seen him for years. Oh, of course the children must now stay with mum. Mum must have most of the care. I mean, it's a very effective means of driving men out of children's lives. This is state-sponsored parental alienation, and it's a really easy route to shut men out. If men are really lucky, they're allowed to pay for supervised contact with their children, where every interaction is monitored and can be used against them in court. I mean, I've talked to men about this system. I mean, utterly outrageous system. And most men don't last the distance. It pushes most men further out of the children's lives than they give up. What we've seen over the last few decades is governments, particularly our Labor government, as Stuart Lindsay pointed out, very actively promoting this process. Last year, we saw an outrageous assault on our Family Law Act, which removed almost all the provisions that had made Australia a world leader in supporting children's rights to have two parents involved in their care after divorce. I mean, I remember for years we'd see people come to Australia to look at our system, which enshrined that right for children. And it all was pushed out the door when they removed almost all mention of fathers from the Family Law Act. And what have they done since then? They've decided to give more assets to victims of domestic violence. And Lindsay talked to me at length about that this sets the judges an impossible task, he said, trying to find evidence of the impact of domestic violence, often over decades of a marriage. Only result of all of this, he says, is going to be trials needlessly extended, billable hours for expensive lawyers, and more pain for the families concerned. And all of this amounts to massive state-enforced parental alienation on an enormous scale. What really scares me is no one is allowed to talk about this. And if you do talk about this, you get into a hell of a lot of trouble, as I've found. The last few years, there was a few years ago, a YouGov survey showing Australia has the second highest rate of false allegations in the world, mainly relating to custody matters. We have an utterly dysfunctional family law system, which has always refused to enforce parenting orders. Every mother knows that she can blatantly flaunt a parenting order. Dad could drive halfway across Australia, turn up on her door to see the kids. He could say, sorry, you're not seeing them, and nothing will happen to him. Stuart Lindsay described actually deciding to send a woman in that situation who'd flaunted orders again and again and again. He decided to send her to prison, and he did this. It's in a Twitter because no one had ever done it before. They didn't know quite what the procedure would be, which says a great deal to me. The other issue that he raised with me is the issue of the failure of the court to give penalties for false allegations, for proven cases of perjury. And there is a system in place. These cases can be referred to the Attorney General's Department. And what happens? The Attorney General's Department refuses to act. I just want to mention, of course, along with the domestic violence accusations, we've also got sexual accusations. And there was a classic case of this I talked about recently, a man called Adrian Granger. That's the name the family court gave to him. Really interesting story. His wife accused him of sexual assault on their young daughter. And the daughter was immediately awarded $10,000 victims' compensation. And even though there were 3 subsequent family court cases where 3 judges determined that those claims were fabricated, Granger is unable to get our state to remove that decision to give this woman, give the child, when she turns 18, this $10,000. So as Granger said, that means the state is telling the daughter that he's an abuser. And the system is supporting this. I mean, it's just crazy. What was fascinating about that particular case is the mother relocated to the UK during COVID with the daughter. And even though there was a Hague Convention case, and she was ordered to return with the child to Australia, which an order she defied a number of times. What's happened since then is the family court has ruled that she can actually relocate now permanently to the UK with her child. And so the mother has been rewarded for actively engaging in alienation of that father from the child, particularly with those false allegations. I mean, it drives me crazy. We have a system which is totally out of control. Queensland Police are responding to a domestic violence order now, domestic violence call every 3 minutes. Up to 90% of police time, according to the police union, is spent on domestic violence. And what they're doing now is seeking orders which will enable them to not even need to go near a court. They can just hand out domestic violence protection orders like parking tickets. And probably the most frightening thing for me is also the fact that it's so easy to set up breaches of domestic violence orders. you know, if you know if you know whether your husband or ex-husband works or whatever, you can just turn up near to where he will be, and that can be a breach of the order, and a couple of those breaches, and he gets sent to prison. 42% of prisoners in New South Wales are on remand, which means they are locked up without a trial. And most of them are domestic violence cases. I was talking to a man the other day who was in prison over a false allegation. He's been let out now, and his cellmate was in prison for sending his daughter a birthday card. So, moving on, what questions are required, what changes are required, and why? To me, what happens in these battles over individual couples dealing with this really vexed issue aren't nearly as important as what I've been talking about tonight, state-sponsored alienation. That's what's causing most damage to children in this country. And we need to start talking about this. We need to start exposing what's going on here. Most people don't even know the sort of facts I've been discussing tonight. Our media does a terrific job censoring public discussion of this issue and promoting the believe all women narrative. We need to lobby politicians. We have to change the laws. Do we really want to live in a society where police are responding, spending 90% of their time on what are often false allegations or accusations based on really minor misbehaviour that certainly doesn't need police intervention? Every week I have lawyers come to me wanting to talk about these issues, who are really concerned about what's going on here. And last year we had a conference on restoring the presumption of innocence. I'm doing my best, and my followers, I have hundreds of people wanting to get involved in trying to change what's going on here. And so when the question is, what can you do? If you're interested in this issue that concerns me, state-sponsored parental alienation, maybe you'd like to help me with this process of trying to change the public narrative and do something about this very dangerous situation where our justice system has been so weaponized against men. I have a new system I've called the Arndt Army of volunteers working in various areas, lawyers working together to try to change the way that the laws are being implemented, police officers working together. There's lots you can do. So if you'd like to get involved, have a look at I have a Substack blog, and you can learn all about the Arndt Army. Thanks very much. I was just thinking, I'm probably one of your angry activists.
Speaking with passion, Bettina, and thank you.
I'm an angry activist. I didn't used to be. I used to do this really carefully, and the older I've got, the crankier I've got.
It's very interesting, Bettina, because we've got both professionals and parents that are joining us online. There's a lot of professionals in the room there in Perth with Pete and Glenn, and I've got a lot of follow-up questions in the Q&A for both yourself and Glenn that have come from this. But what's interested me particularly is a couple of mums have actually made comments saying it's very hard to hear what you've just said, but I can actually relate to a lot of what you've said, Bettina, because I've been through some of it, but it hurts to hear how much that's being turned against dads, because I can understand it from what I've been through. So I think Glenn mentioned that also this happens to mums as well, but it's very interesting when we stand in the middle and we address what we're seeing. So thank you so much for sharing your views.